All right, welcome to another deep dive, everybody.
Yeah, welcome.
Today we're going to be diving into how to defend yourself in 3 seconds or less.
Sounds intense.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book that has a lot of practical self-defense tips and advice.
So people want to be able to defend themselves quickly and effectively.
Yeah, that's the whole premise, right? That most altercations are decided very quickly.
And it focuses on practical things people can actually use, not fancy moves.
Right, not like that movie stuff that you see.
Yeah, exactly. Like those long choreographed fight scenes. This is more about like real world down and dirty.
Yeah, real world instinctual kind of stuff.
So are we ready to dive in and see what these 3 second or less self-defense techniques are all about?
Yeah, I think so. Let's start with the book's concept of the 3 second secret. What is that?
Okay, so the 3 second secret basically boils down to the idea that most violent encounters are decided really quickly, like within the first few seconds.
So no time for like fancy moves or anything.
Right, exactly. The idea is that you need to react fast and decisively.
So the focus is on escaping danger, not like winning a fight in the traditional sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's about getting out of the situation unharmed.
Okay, that makes sense. And they also talk about something called 0 second self-defense.
Right. That's where awareness comes in. If you're really aware of your surroundings, you might be able to prevent an attack from even happening.
So like if you see someone who looks suspicious, you cross the street or avoid them.
Yeah, or just generally being alert and aware of your surroundings.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So what happens if, the situation does escalate? How do they recommend we react in those critical first few seconds?
Well, they lay out this pretty intuitive 1, 2, 3 approach.
One, two, three.
It's avoid, counter, escape.
Okay.
And it's not meant to be like a rigid set of rules, but more of a guide to help you react quickly and effectively.
So avoid if possible, counter if you have to, and always try to escape.
Exactly. That's the gist of it.
Makes sense. Now, one thing that really caught my eye was their idea of how to win every single fight ever.
Yeah, it sounds pretty bold, right?
Yeah.
But their answer is really simple. Run away.
Really?
Yeah, running away is often the smartest and safest thing you can do.
I mean, it's not what you usually hear. Usually it's like stand your ground and fight back.
Yeah, but in a real-world situation, running away is often the most strategic move. You're not trying to prove anything, you're just trying to survive.
Right. Makes sense. So, how far should we be prepared to run? Do they give a recommendation?
They recommend being able to run at least half a mile.
Half a mile. Okay, that's a decent distance.
Yeah, it should give you enough time and space to get away from danger.
And if you can't run for whatever reason, like
Yeah.
what if you're cornered or injured?
Well, in some situations like, say, a mugging, where the attacker just wants your valuables, it might be best to just hand them over.
Okay, so better to lose your wallet than get hurt.
Yeah, exactly. Your safety is the most important thing.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So, moving on to awareness and preparedness, what are some key things the book emphasizes?
Well, they really stress paying attention to your surroundings, like all the time.
So, not just walking around with your head in the clouds.
Right, exactly.
I know.
They also talk about something called projection, which is basically about sending nonverbal cues that make you look less like a target.
So, like walking confidently and making eye contact with people around you.
Yeah, and even small things like standing up straight and having a purpose to your movements can make a difference.
Interesting. And they mention some specific warning signs that an attack might be imminent.
Yeah, things like tense shoulders, clenched fists, or even changes in skin color can be red flags.
So, basically, any signs that someone is getting agitated or aggressive.
Exactly. And they really emphasize that if you sense danger, your first priority should always be escape.
Okay, so avoid the situation if possible, run if you have to, and only fight as a last resort.
Right. And if you do have to fight, they recommend this position they call the ready position.
Okay, what's that?
It's a non-aggressive stance where you're standing with your feet shoulder width apart, your body turned slightly to the side, and your hands up around chest height.
So you're not like squaring up for a fight, but you're ready to react if you need to.
Right, exactly. And they also talk about the power of using your voice, like shouting, "Stay away," or something similar.
So projecting confidence and assertiveness can sometimes deter an attacker?
Yeah, definitely. And they also briefly touch on the legal aspects of self-defense.
Oh, right, because if you do have to defend yourself, you need to be able to justify your actions.
Exactly. You need to be able to show that you were genuinely in fear for your safety and that your response was reasonable.
Makes sense, makes sense. So, to recap, the main priorities are protecting your head, keeping your hands up in a non-threatening way, using body language to de-escalate, avoiding physical confrontation if possible, using your voice to deter attackers, acting decisively if you are attacked, but stopping when the threat ends, and projecting an image that you're not an easy target.
That's a great summary.
So what happens if things do go wrong, despite our best efforts?
Well, the book stresses the importance of immediately assessing yourself for injuries.
So like checking for broken bones or bleeding.
Yeah, and if you're injured, seeking help right away.
And they advise against removing impaled objects, right? Because that could make things worse.
Exactly. And even if you don't think you're injured, they recommend preserving your clothing as potential evidence.
Right, that makes sense. And they also talk about some of the psychological effects of a violent encounter, like shock and nightmares.
Yeah, and they stress the importance of reporting the incident to the police and writing down everything you remember as soon as possible.
So even if you feel okay physically, there's still a lot to process and deal with emotionally.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's move on to the specific techniques. What are some of the essential tools they recommend?
Well, they divide self-defense training into 3 categories: techniques, exercises, and drills.
Okay.
And they emphasize that you should focus on simple, effective techniques, not complicated moves.
So like what kind of strikes do they recommend?
They're big on the palm heel strike, which is basically striking with the heel of your open hand.
Safer than a fist, right? Because you're less likely to break your hand.
Exactly. And they also list a few other hand strikes, like claw hand, elbow strikes, hammer fist, finger jab, thumb gouge.
Okay. And what about kicks?
They advise keeping kicks low for stability and targeting vulnerable areas like the shin, knee, groin.
Low and powerful.
Right, yeah. And they list a few basic kicks like the front kick, heel stamp, snap kick, side kick, round kick.
So a good mix of strikes to choose from, and they talk about specific target zones.
Yeah, they emphasize aiming for areas that are most likely to cause pain or disorientation.
So like the eyes, throat, groin, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Now they also talk about the power of distraction and evasion.
Right. They say that sometimes you can create an opportunity to escape by distracting your attacker.
So like throwing something at them or yelling something unexpected.
Yeah, or even just asking them a random question.
That's interesting. So get them off balance mentally, then use that moment to get away.
Exactly.
And for evasion, they obviously emphasize running away, but they also mention a few other tactics.
Yeah, like changing your appearance by putting on or taking off a hat or jacket or blending into a crowd.
So basically making yourself less noticeable and harder to follow.
Right.
Now, they have a section on grappling, but they actually advise against it in most street situations.
Yeah, they say that grappling on the ground is too risky because of the unpredictable surface and the possibility of multiple attackers.
Right, so you don't want to end up on the ground if you can avoid it.
Exactly.
But what if you do fall or get knocked down? They do have a section on how to fall properly.
Yeah, they talk about something called a break fall, which is basically a way of falling that minimizes the risk of injury.
So like tucking your chin and rolling with the fall?
Yeah, and using your arms to absorb some of the impact.
Makes sense. And what if you find yourself on the ground with an attacker on top of you?
Well, they emphasize protecting your head above all else.
So cover your head with your arms.
Right, and then try to use your legs to create space or strike the attacker.
So even on the ground, you're not completely helpless.
Exactly. And they give some specific advice on how to get back to your feet safely.
Okay, because just scrambling up could leave you vulnerable?
Right. They recommend creating space with a kick and then using one arm to guard your head while you push yourself up with the other.
So always maintain some level of defense, even when you're getting back on your feet.
Exactly.
Before they get into specific techniques, they have a section called Principle Before Practice.
Yeah, they really stress the importance of understanding the underlying principles of self-defense, like awareness and avoidance, before you even start learning specific techniques.
So it's not just about memorizing moves, it's about having the right mindset.
Right. They say that knowing how to react instinctively is more important than knowing a lot of fancy moves.
That makes sense. And they also talk about setting self-defense goals.
Yeah, they encourage you to think in advance about what you would do in different situations so you're not trying to make decisions under pressure.
So like, what are your priorities? Escape. Protecting yourself. Protecting someone else.
Exactly. And they recommend categorizing your goals as essential, important, and optional.
Okay, that's a helpful framework.
And then they finally get into specific techniques.
All right, let's hear some of them.
They start with the guarding block, which they recommend doing with open hands.
Open hands, okay.
Yeah, they say it's less aggressive and keeps your arms more relaxed.
Interesting. And they emphasize that striking power comes from the core, not just arm strength.
Right, and they recommend exploring other training systems like Kizi or Wing Chun if you want to develop your striking skills further.
Okay, good to know. And when it comes to making a fist, they have some specific advice.
Yeah, they say to make sure your thumb is tucked outside your fingers, not inside.
So you don't injure your thumb when you punch.
Ex-
Okay, let's hear some of the specific defenses. What do they recommend for a swinging punch, like a haymaker?
They say to use a high block with your nearest arm to deflect the punch and then counter with a palm heel strike to the face.
So deflect and counter.
Yeah, and always return to your guard and look for an escape route.
Okay, what about a straight punch?
They recommend shifting your weight slightly to the side to avoid the punch, and then using your forward hand to slap it away and down, followed by a back fist to the nose.
So a bit more of a subtle deflection and then a quick counter.
Right.
And what about close range defense when someone's right up in your face?
They say to use a tighter guarding block and strike with your elbow, aiming for the head or neck.
Elbows are powerful at close range.
Yeah, and they can be surprising too.
Makes sense. What about a front choke defense?
They recommend quickly bringing your hands up inside the attacker's arms and then yanking their hands down, followed by a kick to the groin.
So break the choke, then counter.
Exactly.
And what if someone grabs your collar?
Reach over their hand with your opposite arm, grab their hand, and then snap it down while pushing into their elbow with your other arm.
So using leverage to twist them down.
Right.
Okay, and for lower body techniques, they emphasize keeping kicks low.
Yeah, and using them in combination with blocks or dodges.
Block high, strike low.
Right, and then escape.
What about a lunging attack?
They say to twist your body and use your palm to deflect the attack, followed by a front kick to the knee.
Again, using their momentum against them.
Exactly.
And they have a second defense for a high swinging punch.
Yeah, it's the same high block, but this time the counter is a rear leg kick to the groin.
Okay, targeting a different vulnerable area.
Right.
And they advise caution because the attacker might double over and headbutt you.
Yeah, that's why it's important to keep your hands up to protect your head.
Good point. And when is a knee strike most effective?
They say it's best for very close range when you can grab onto the attacker for stability.
So kind of a clinch situation.
Yeah.
And how do you defend against a groin kick?
They recommend twisting your waist and front leg inward to close off the groin and then countering with a side kick to the knee or a palm strike to the face.
So deflect and counter.
Right.
And they have some extra techniques for specific scenarios.
Yeah, like what to do if you're attacked from behind while you're against a wall.
That sounds like a tricky situation.
It is. But they say to quickly turn your head to see the attacker and then deliver a side kick backward to the midsection.
Okay, using the wall to your advantage.
Right.
And they also cover how to escape a bear hug from behind.
Yeah, they give a few options like snapping your head back to break their nose, stomping on their feet, or dropping your weight and thrusting your arms out to break their grip.
So multiple ways to break free.
Exactly.
And then they have a really interesting secret tip about aiming low.
Yeah, they say the most common mistake people make when they kick to the groin is not protecting their head.
Because the attacker might double over and headbutt you?
Exactly. So they emphasize keeping your hands up to guard your head, even as you're delivering the kick.
Okay, that's crucial.
Yeah, it's a really important detail.
And to make these techniques more effective, they talk about drills and exercises.
Right. They recommend practicing the techniques in increasingly realistic scenarios.
So starting with static drills and then adding movement, multiple attackers, and other challenges.
Exactly. It's about building muscle memory and instinctive reactions.
Makes sense. And finally, they have a brief section on weapons.
Yeah, they say that weapon defense is a complex topic, but they give a few general principles.
Like what to do if someone pulls a knife or a gun on you.
Right. They say that if someone has a knife, your priority is to create distance.
And if they have a gun?
Your priority is to get out of the line of fire.
Makes sense.
And they say that if you have to use a weapon yourself, use it as a distraction to help you escape, not to engage in a fight.
Okay, so avoidance and escape are still the primary goals, even when weapons are involved.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it's been great.
So, to sum it up, how to defend yourself in 3 seconds or less is about being aware of your surroundings, avoiding dangerous situations, and having a few simple, effective techniques to fall back on if you absolutely have to.
That's a great takeaway.
Now, thinking about all this, what's one small change you could make in your daily life to be more aware and prepared?
That's a good question.
Something simple, but maybe impactful.
Yeah, I think I'll start paying more attention to my surroundings when I'm out walking.
That's a great idea. And for our listeners, if you want to delve deeper into these concepts, the book recommends checking out The Fence by Jeff Thompson, Self-Defense Tips Everyone Should Know by Neil Martin, and The Art of Mental Training by DC Gonzalez.
Those are all great resources.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
See you next time.
Take care.
Bye.